We are going to start today with Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7, and we're going to do verses 1 to 12 today of Romans chapter 7. But before we start, is there any questions from last week? We did Romans 6, 15 to 23 last week. No? So just a recap from last week, Romans chapter 6, verses 15 to 23. Paul gives a dichotomy as far as people group, okay? And when I say a dichotomy, I mean two options, not three, two. And there's a fallacy called false dichotomy, is where you talk to someone and they'll put you either in two categories, and there's a guilt trip that happens, or they try to trap you. He says, well, it's either on this team or this team, right? You're either conservative or liberal, right? Like there's only two. In Canada they have 5, right? But yeah, 5 political parties. But it's Paul here is saying there's only two options that you have, and that is you are a slave, every single one of us, you're a slave, but you only have two masters, and one is of sin, and one is of Christ. That's it. He also gives another dichotomy, and that is you're either of Team Adam, you're either under the sins of Adam, or you're under Christ. That's it. So I say this because we categorize today, especially if we're talking about 2020 and how things have gotten very quickly. But in 2020, you hear all these labeling, right? Race, ethnicity. I think we were talking earlier about like every month is always some emphasis about being female, being a certain sexual preference, being right, on and on and on. I wonder where the month of the straight month parade will be. Right?
Yeah, everything else has their own month now.
Well, when is straight month, right? Right, but there's all these categories you hear people say. But Paul essentially says, no, there's only two, and that is you're either under Adam or you're under Christ. And then chapter 6, you're either a slave of sin or you're either a slave of Christ. And it really provokes, I'll say, Westerners when I talk to certain people who claim to be Christian, but their allegiance is really for America, or their allegiance is for Western values, but they don't even know it. Is that essentially this whole notion of independence, I can do whatever I want, full autonomy, is actually not true. If you understand human nature, human anthropology, as far as the way we are as people, no one is free. No one is free. And the only two people in human history that have ever been fully autonomous as far as they could do what they pleased was Adam and Eve. Okay, they were the only ones because there was no sin nature. So when we say slavery, we think external master, right? And I'm the slave. But if I don't have an external master, guess where slavery persists? Guess where there is slavery? Inside the human heart. So when you see people go to NAAA, an addiction meeting, there's no master, there's no chains, physical chains that is, there's no whip, right? But the implication is there's some internal slavery that I'm dealing with. Something outside of me has control over me. And that's, again, there's no word of addiction in the Bible, but the concept that Paul uses very similarly is that of idolatry. There's a desire that's so strong within me, that's not Christ, but it's some other substance that has control over me, right? Once the desire perks up in my heart, I follow it. I can't say no to it, even though sometimes I want to say no, but I follow it. That's slavery. True freedom is where a substance that you once always said yes to is in front of you, and it doesn't faze you anymore. That's true liberty, right? And that's essentially what Christ working in your heart is supposed to do, and that's liberty. So when you are a slave of Christ, it means you're truly free. Okay, but the point is, you're always a slave to someone, either your sinful nature or that of Christ. But if you're a slave to Christ, that's true freedom. Okay.
Just frozen.
Oh.
Bye.
So if it happens maybe one more time, I think we might need to get you have a computer?
If it'll work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me run out and get it while you're powering.
Yeah. Sorry guys online. So essentially,
There you are.
I'm hoping the photo was good. That was one of those renaissance. One
In
of
your
those.
bathing suit? I bathing suit like that, man.
I'm hoping it was a Renaissance photo, but essentially, and again, if it freezes again, we're going to use Virginia's computer, so it might take a bit. I apologize, guys, online, but essentially, this is it's very similar to Christ, right? Christ says you cannot serve what? Two masters, right? Meaning it's an either or mindset. Okay, it's something that happens within the heart. Okay, so in chapter 7, Paul continues the train of thought. Okay, as far as this dichotomy. Okay, let's all go to chapter 7 of Romans, which is our passage. And can someone read, let's just say, verses 1 to 6? We're only going to do 1 to 12 today. So Romans 7, 1 to 12. But can someone read verses 1 to 6?
Or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive, but if her husband dies, she is free from that law. And if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, we were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code.
All right. So the dichotomy continues. Okay, so remember, chapter 5, you're either team Adam or team Jesus. Chapter 6, you're either team, as far as slavery goes, Christ or sinful nature. We're slaves to either one. And then in chapter 7, he now brings up the illustration of marriage. Okay, marriage, from verses 1 to 6. And that is very similar as far as the dichotomy. You're either married to the law or you're married to the law of Christ. One of the two. Okay? Now, in verses 1 to 3, he brings up marriage. Verses 4 to 6, he brings up a different marriage. But question, is marriage a good or bad experience? Good? That's the right that's the right answer. It depends. Okay? And this is very similar to what Paul is bringing up here. Again, is marriage a good or a bad experience? It depends. Marriage is a good thing. Okay, the institution of marriage, again, it's ingrained within humanity. Once Adam and Eve was created, marriage happened right away. But the experience of marriage is either good or bad, and it depends. It depends on who your spouse is. In this case, the experience that where Paul is coming from is that of a female. Okay, and it's either contingent upon the husband. Is this a good husband or is this a bad husband? Okay, from verse 1 to 3, Paul talks about essentially a bad marriage. This is what the law was like. Okay, so notice how he says this. question, and he asks in verse 1, or do you not know, brothers? And this he's in chapter 7, verse 1. He's also answering the question from chapter 6, verse 15. Chapter 6, verse 15. He says, "What then are we to sin because we are not under law but under grace?" And he says, "By no means." He also answers the question in chapter 7, verse 1. "Do you not know, brothers? For I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives." Essentially, chapter 7, verse 1. If you are alive, when you are born into this world, you are married to the law of the Old Testament, every single one of us. Okay, here he's speaking to Jews in particular, because they were bragging that they have the Torah, but essentially they're bound to the law. Now, look at verse 2 and 3. For a married woman, now he's talking about the perspective of a woman. For a married woman is bound by the law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Verse 3, accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Okay? So, question is, here, it's really about remarriage. Okay, remarriage as far as a female. Now, we have what's going on here is there is remarriage laws in the Old Testament, and this is from Deuteronomy chapter 24. It's the whole chapter, but essentially, in this time, and I'm pretty sure we all know this. Even around first century, women did not have any rights, really. They were considered second-class citizens culturally, and this is not within the Torah, it's just generally, right? But a male could divorce at any moment. But a female could not divorce. And all of a sudden, the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapter 4, there's a shift that happens in the sense that there had to be some sense of an adultery that happened on behalf of the woman. She couldn't divorce him, but he could divorce her. And this is the concept of once he saw that upon her, that he had to write a certificate of marriage, he had to hand it to her, and then she would have to leave. Okay, now it's okay. It's okay. Now what happened was that in order for the woman to be free of the marriage, the husband had to die. That was it. If not, if she walked away and she'd be with another man, she'd be considered an adulteress. Okay? So, essentially, her only way of freedom was if the husband died. And if the husband died, she was therefore free from the marriage and is able to remarry. That was it. Okay? The husband was able to remarry if he saw evidence of sexual immorality, writing the certificate of divorce, giving it to her, she walks out, right? But to the woman, her only means of freedom is if the husband dies, and she's therefore free to marry. Okay, so this is the remarriage laws of the Old Testament. So essentially, when it comes, what Paul is communicating here from verse 1 to 3 is, before Christ, we were all married, but it was a bad marriage, and the illusion that he's given here is pretty much you're bound to this husband that's not pleasant. Okay. I see there are certain things that really bound the human heart, and that is you are attached to someone unpleasant. And it's not even in relationship to marriage. Like, this is Paul's point, but it's not even in relationship. What I mean by that is, for example, if you have a bad roommate, if you have a bad boss, if you're young and you have a bad parent, right? It's unpleasant to be under the roof with them. Right, it affects your emotional well-being. It's as if your soul is suffocating. Right, now imagine a woman that's married to a bad husband, and that's her life. Especially in first century antiquity, your livelihood was dependent upon your husband. So you were really bound. At least here now, in the 21st century, a female could divorce. And it's like, well, I'm going to get a job and make more money than you. Happens all the time, right? But in first century, it couldn't happen. In Deuteronomy, time of Moses, it couldn't happen. right? So it's a bondage, and it's an
He could remarry,
yes,
and
he
she
could.
couldn't.
She couldn't. He
She
could.
just had to be,
Wait till he died.
Yeah, wait till he died. So
or kill him.
right, and
Probably happened
right,
anytime
and
soon.
but like I thought the exact same thing. You know what I mean? Like how, but imagine she gets caught or something like that. Like it's you know, but I'm sympathizing with. Sorry guys, I'm looking at the time. I'm sympathizing with the woman in that state of an unpleasant marriage. How do you feel if you're bound to a husband that's unpleasant?
You want to run away?
Context for you guys online. I'm speaking to all women here, so, so when I look at them, I'm like, "What's it like to be married to a nasty husband?"
Trapped. You feel
You
trapped.
feel trapped,
And miserable.
That's it.
trapped,
Trapped and miserable.
I,
miserable.
Hey, never mind, Hope. I guess.
What was that, Shamika?
What?
Oh, let me just talk.
I'm so sorry.
What?
Angry?
Angry.
Angry that you're stuck?
Desperate.
There's a when there's a here's the picture. There's a rigid husband that is all about the law. A piece of crumb falls on the floor. Right, that's not freedom. You want a crumb to fall on the floor, and it's like he'll be okay if I pick it up, right? But what it does to you, and again, you're living in a state of fear, right? But that's experientially from a woman to in a state of a bad husband, okay? Laws, and if you break it, you're trapped. Okay, Paul is using this illustration to show that this is what it's like before Christ, is that you are naturally under the law, because that's from the Jewish mindset. That's your only means to getting approval of God, right? But again, you're back to the whole law-based understanding, and it's very similar to the woman who is bound to a husband that's all about rigidity, that is all about the law, and it's unpleasant. And you kind of alluded to it, Trish. We're waiting up for him to die, right? We're waiting for him to die, and this is where Paul is getting at. Okay, look at verse 4 to 6. Can someone read that out loud? Verse 4 to 6.
So, my brothers, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit to God. When we were controlled by the sinful nature, the sinful passions aroused by the law, we were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what we once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we will serve in the new way of the Spirit and not of the old way of the written code.
All right, so from verse 4 to 6, guys online, we're under a minute, so let's all exit off and we'll come right back on, okay? Guys online, just press end and then come right back on.
Okay.
Okay.
And
yeah, my keys aren't working.
That's okay.
I put something that's like, this is your tutorial.
When that happens, where you're like you're in a public setting. So, we're back on, and I just find it funny he's talking about like a woman in a bad marriage. Here in verse 4 to 6, okay, from verse 4 to 6, he now changes. Okay, from verse 1 to 3, this is what it's like being under the law. Okay, you have a bad husband, but guess what? That wish, he's actually dead. Okay, so the husband dies, and now you're free to remarry. Essentially, the imagery is now there's a remarriage as far as us. So at one point we were bound to the law by nature. We were born into it, and as a result, when we came to Christ, it's as if our old husband died and we have a new husband. That's Christ. That's exactly what Paul is saying. So essentially, it's a good marriage versus a bad marriage from verse 1 to 3 to a good marriage. A bad husband in verse 1 to 3? To a good husband. But in order for that transaction, as far as the remarriage laws to happen, one had to die. The husband had to die. And as a result, there's a liberty to remarry. Right? What's Boaz and Ruth, the book of Ruth? Right? Her old husband died, and because he's dead, she's now remarried. She's now free to remarry. Who does she choose to remarry? Boaz. And he's a picture of Christ. Right? So, living under grace is like a good marriage. Look at verse 4. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law from the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. This here is from verse 4 is how each starts. We're born into the marriage of the law, and then we're brought into the marriage of Christ by his death. Okay, so remember, we're naturally married to the law when we're born into this world. So it's something that's outside of our wills that just happens. So think of it like an arranged marriage. Now, arranged marriage is somewhat broad. It's how two people come together, but in a lot of instances, most of world history, there was arranged marriage, and a lot of it is good, but a lot of it is bad. How? It depends on who you marry, right? And I've had friends who've had arranged marriages, and some of it is great, but I've had friends who have arranged marriages, and it's terrible. Why? Depending on the person you marry. Especially in this context, it's depending on the husband that you have. Okay? So I kind of think of an Islamic marriage, to be honest, like when I think of this, as far as like you're just brought into it. And the reason why I say Islamic marriage is because I thought of this earlier. When you think of Islamic women, in Western culture, there's not. Can anyone name? And I'm not trying to put them under the bus, but trying to prove a point. Can anyone name an Islamic woman that has done anything prominent? An invention, a book written, that has a full-on hijab where you can just see her eyes? Like, do you know her name? Like, is there anyone?
What was a young girl that wrote a book?
Oh, the Indian?
Yeah.
I think she might be Hindu.
Oh,
I believe.
Okay.
I have her in mind. I have her in mind, but I think I'm.
But they were going to kill her.
Well,
got
they
her
do more
blocked
now.
To die.
I mean, this isn't like, there's a well-known tennis player that's
Okay.
a Muslim.
Does she have the hijab? Does she follow Islamic law?
Well, I just found out she was a Muslim because I'm watching the French Open right now,
Okay.
and it said that she is, a Muslim, but she wore a tennis outfit, and I thought, oh, they let her do that.
And she showed skin?
Yeah.
Okay, well, she would be executed based upon
So,
Sharia law.
Right.
But again, it's a rhetorical question.
But there is somebody in the sports world that wore,
The hijab?
but was doing the sport, but I can't think of what it was. Because I thought, this is weird. How can
Right.
she do that?
But she showed her face and skin?
She had,
Oh.
like, she wore, I don't know if she had her head covered, her arms covered, her
Yeah.
legs covered. I
Yeah.
don't know about her face. I
Okay.
can't think of the sport. I'm trying to think of it. But
What sports could play? Maybe tennis? Maybe I know, not even tennis.
I don't know, but I remember thinking, wow.
Well, it's a rhetorical question. Like, essentially, like, there's not a lot, right? I can think of a lot of women in Western civilization that have done like amazing things, and we honor them, we study them, right? But when it comes to a woman bound in Sharia law, there's nothing. It's arranged marriage, and guess who has full control? The husband does. So it's suffocating within the person. There's because you're suffocated inside, you can't really do much outside, right? And again, my point is, it's as far as the imagery of what Paul is saying, is there's a bondage that happens when we're under the law. But when the husband dies, there's now liberty, and we're able to remarry in freedom, and that is Christ. So essentially, from verse 1 to 3, it's a bad marriage, but we're married to the law, and it gives us no freedom. There's almost a suffocation to the human soul. But then when you're married to Christ, guess what? There's liberty. There's liberty. There's freedom. So if I drop if I drop a little crumb, I'm not, oh great, my husband's about to come here. Right? That's fear, right? Versus there's grace. If I do, that's fine, right? He's not gonna. I'm not gonna get yelled at, or there's that lack of fear is there. Kevin, did you have a question?
Yeah. So if the wife like drops a crumb, with her husband, like is that controlling, or like what? Like if you're looking at the actions of another person, let's say they're like making a messy counter, like stuff like that, is like what type of, why is the law like controlling like that, or like why does it manifest into fear and all that?
Well, that's kind of it, the crumb thing. I just made up, meaning that it's an illustration to show, say there's a husband that's rigid, that's all law. So if you don't follow the commandment perfectly, there's a fear of and the essence of what Paul is saying is abandonment. Like
It's like becoming a slave.
And that's what I'm saying. Like emotionally, that was kind of my point. Paul doesn't even have to use husband and wife. He could use, and he used slave in chapter 6.
Yeah.
It's just someone above you that's in control, and it's not pleasant within your heart. So that's why I said you could use a boss, you could use a roommate, you could use a landlord, you could use, like, if who here has had a bad boss before, right? And you're driving to work, and it's not pleasant, right? Your boss, typically your posture is like this. Your posture is just like all relaxed, and your boss comes right, but there's a fear, and that reaction is like you need to be perfect around them. And the reason why you weren't like this when they came by is because they wouldn't accept you in that posture, right? And again, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't necessarily have to be a husband. It could be a boss, etc. But the point is, there has to be this rigid, perfect way of doing things. If not, there's a fear of abandonment. And the reason why there's a fear of abandonment, because this is in relationship to God, right? If I don't follow the law perfectly, then will God bless me? Will he leave me? And that is the ultimate fear of humanity, is true abandonment, but abandonment from God. Okay, so that was my point of the crumb on the floor, Kevin. Like it just made, like, like there could be other things, but it's just not doing what the husband, like, a rigid husband has a certain way of doing things. He has a certain mindset. The house has to be like this. You're supposed to do it like this. If it doesn't happen, then the woman gets it from the husband, right? And it's, whatever that looks like.
Now, she'd also be afraid of divorce, and then what would she do?
Right, and in this context, you're nothing at this point. You have no money, you have no job, right? It's your shame at this point. So that's what I'm saying. Like women, especially in Moses' time and in first century, from around this time, there was nothing you could do. So there's utter fear inside a woman's heart. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just interesting to me, just in terms of like how to treat others, and I think there are people out there who get upset with like dropping a crumb,
Yeah, and don't eat fruit in the car, and if you drop a grape, get out of my car. Like, it's just, we all have our own things that we value, but again, the imagery of a rigid husband is kind of what Paul is saying. And the only way that the woman could be free is if he died, right? So, and once he's dead, there's now a liberty to remarry. And again, the imagery is us, who is bound to this rigid husband that's called the law, and that law is now dead because of Christ, and now we're free to remarry Christ. Okay? So, look at verse 5 and 6. Look at the end of verse 4, he says, in order that we may bear the fruit of God, fruit for God, for while we're living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law, we're at work in our members to bear fruit for death. Okay, so notice the bearing fruit part. The end of verse, and if we may bear fruit for God, the end of verse 5, if our members bear fruit for death. bearing fruit for God, bearing fruit for death. But now we are released from the law. Okay, praise God, having died to that which held us captive. Notice the captivity language, so that we serve in a new way the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. Okay, so the fruit of the good versus the bad husband. Okay, there's fruit that comes from the bad husband. There's fruit that comes from the good husband. The fruit that comes from the bad husband, which is the law, the essence of it is the fear of rejection and abandonment. Okay, as far as a woman in first century, what would happen was you were left alone. Very similar. What is a fear within the human soul is complete abandonment from God. And we've talked about this before. That's the essence of hell. The very essence of hell is abandonment from God. I'm now living life apart from its original intention. Okay, and that is God. Okay? Once a person lives outside of that, a lot of problems will happen. And the sad part about that is they don't even know they're in that state. Right? Looking for love, looking for affirmation, etc. Okay? But the fruit that comes from the Spirit or the law of Christ is unconditional acceptance, and as a result, love, gratitude, happiness, and liberty. Okay? So the fear of rejection versus the liberty of acceptance. Okay? Fine?
But you know, it's a little confusing because the husband is not following God's laws
Mm-hmm.
of marriage and how he's supposed to treat his wife.
Right.
That he's supposed to treat her just like he would treat himself, you know.
Yeah.
That they're one person.
Yeah.
But he's okay, he can do all that and it's fine. But, and the husband, and the wife has to stay there and take it, I guess.
Yeah.
So that, to me, that's kind of confusing.
In the husband sense?
In the husband sense, well, both, really.
I'm
Well,
confused.
say if you're married to a man that beating you and making you do things that you don't particularly want to do, just to be mean.
Okay.
Just a mean man. And he's not really following God's laws that pertains to marriage.
Yeah.
Because there's a pretty lengthy, you know, tells you what you're supposed to do as a husband and as a wife.
Right.
But the woman has to stay and take it, and the man is allowed to do whatever he wants to.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
But again, that's a picture that Paul is giving here,
yeah.
right? It's this unfortunate situation that a woman is in, right?
Well, would the man be considered godlike? Or would he be considered a Christian, or
Probably not following.
no?
Like you know, we in the Old Testament, there's a lot of people that we look up to that they were just not good husbands,
Right.
right? So, right?
It's like God showed him, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want to.
Yeah,
She has to stay.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Well, he knows what he's doing, so I'm not gonna worry about it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, why wouldn't they stand behind her and help her out of that situation? Because he's not following.
He's not following
the law.
Christ.
Yeah,
Right.
so
Well,
these are.
But it does say
Good
in the Bible,
Christians.
if he wants to leave, let him go.
yeah.
So
Now, did the rigidity of this is the rigidity of the Jewish law in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So if you read this passage, who's the one who is bound? The man or the woman?
both.
Well,
They should be.
It's the
Well,
woman.
the woman's
According
bound
to
The
to
woman,
the man.
woman can't do anything. So you read Matthew 5, which also where Christ talks about the exact same passage. Who's bound? It's all the woman. She's considered an adulteress. Matthew 5, she's considered an adulteress. Romans 7, she's considered an adulteress. Why? Because they're alluding to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Same thing, right? But there's progressive revelation that happens in the New Testament where now the wife could divorce now. Because remember, the reason why it's the women in these two passages because they're alluding to Deuteronomy 24. We don't really abide by Deuteronomy 24, right? So there's now a woman could divorce if the husband is an adulterer, right? The woman could divorce now if the husband is an unbeliever. The woman could divorce if it pertained to something like death, meaning that she's being abused, right? So those are the three criteria as far as divorce in the New Testament now, where it's both if someone commits adultery, if someone's an unbelieving, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says this, if someone's an unbeliever, and number 3 is if there's something pertaining to death, meaning is there someone's life on the line? I typically be a husband to a wife, but there's there's cases where a female will abuse the husband, right? A wife will be, so in these cases now it's both and. The reason why in Romans 7 and Matthew 5 it's only the female is bound is because they're alluding to the Jewish law of the Old Testament. So, and then this goes into the conversation of there are 3 laws in the Old Testament. So there was ceremonial, there was civil, and then there was moral. So a lot of it had to do with it only pertaining to that time of the Old Testament, right? As far as ceremonial, when it comes to sacrifice, well, we don't have a temple, so what's the point of what's the point of keeping those laws? It came to civil laws. The Israelites need to be physically distinct from other nations. So we have to eat these food, we have to practice these in a certain way, we have to dress in a certain way, but there was moral laws that happened. The only thing that really carried on to the New Testament was the moral law of God. And it still pertains to today. So this is why in the discussion of same-sex marriage, say Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus chapter 22, it mentions you'll stone someone that's practicing homosexuality. The prohibition against homosexuality still persists today because it's moral, right? When it comes to ceremony or making a physical distinction, these laws we don't follow today, right? So very similar to divorce, it's the same thing, right? But that's something that women now had more rights, had more say. So if you want to know the essence of, like, again, just again, this is not planned, right? But look, I use Islam as an illustration, right? And the sad part about that is that's today. That's today.
It's still going on today.
This is in the 21st century. Is that women have no rights today? Well, look at Western civilization. Women have rights,
Oh, yeah.
right? But Western civilization was based upon what? Judeo-Christian values. So people, the progressives, liberals don't, but consent for a woman to say no to a man when it came to sex, or it came from Paul. It was something that slowly developed because in Rome at the time, that just the culture, it was social status. Someone that was that was at a higher class could pick and choose who they wanted to be with, right? But things changed when the Apostle Paul brought in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, and when Christianity really spread in 313, it was called the Edict of Milan. And in the Edict of Milan, Christianity just became legal because it was illegal before. And from 313, Christianity just spread like wildfire in Rome. And in 380, it was called the Council of Thessalonica, which essentially made Christianity the official religion of Rome. It's not, we're forcing you to be a Christian, if not, we're going to kill you. It was just, it's the official religion in the sense that everyone's believing it now at this point. So the minute it became legal, it was like it spread. But the moral status of Rome changed too. Paul. So I'm just saying things progressively changed when Christianity came about, right? So women had more rights, right? And a lot of the times when it came to women not having rights, it was cultural. It was global in that sense, and around the time, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah. Because I would imagine if they just let the woman just get out of the house, a lot of them probably died because they couldn't take care of themselves.
Yeah. Or they would.
Or their children would.
Or they would intentionally be a slave or a prostitute.
Right.
Because that's, what could you do?
They'd probably lose their children too because
Right.
you wouldn't let them take the children with them.
Remember when we were in Christmas, we were talking about we did a talk on Saint Nicholas, and that's why he was, like, the essence of why he was famous, right? There was 3 daughters, and they had no money. there was a father and they had 3 daughters, but they had no money to marry anyone. So when Saint Nicholas, he heard about this, he put silver in a bag for the exact amount for one girl, for one of the daughters to have a dowry, and then poop, threw it in, and they were like, where'd this come from? Had another sack of silver, and he threw it in the window, and it fell inside of a shoe. So in Germany, they when they have Christmas, we have stockings, they have shoes, right? And it was because the second daughter was able to marry, and the third was that the dad was like, where's this money coming from? And then Saint Nicholas got it, and he threw it in the chimney, and it fell down. And this is where we get the chimney concept, right? So, but the point was the 3 daughters were able to marry, and as they're able to get married, they're able to have a life. But the point was, the reason why the dad of the 3 daughters wasn't distraught, because he didn't have enough money to get married. So as a result, he was about to sell them into slavery, because they had nothing, and this is the way people lived back then. So, yeah. Okay. So the fruit of a good versus a bad husband. Okay. So in verse 1-3 is we were married to the law, which really produced fear, abandonment. Did I do everything right? And sadly, let's be honest, even Christians, I'll say fundamentalists in particular, they live like this. They live like this. They live rigidity to the law. If you don't, if my son or daughter doesn't follow exactly to what I say or what the Bible says, it's like I disown you, right? And this is the antithetical to what Paul is saying here. Verse 4 and 6, we have a new husband. We're dead to our old husband. Now we're married to Christ, and in a sense, there is liberty now. Okay? So again, the dichotomy from chapter 5, as far as Adam, Christ, the dichotomy of chapter 6, a slave to sin versus a slave to Christ. Chapter 7 is now we're married to either the law or we're either married to Christ. Okay? Either or. Okay? Can someone read verse 7-12 out loud? Can someone read 7-12?
What then shall we say that the law is sin? By no means. He writes a lot like that.
What's that?
What shall we say then? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness, for apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good.
Okay, so here in chapter 7, verse 7, Paul is now asking his third question. And when I say third question, he pretty much from chapter 6-8 asks 4 questions. The first question he asks is in chapter 6, verse 1. What then shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. The second question, chapter 6, verse 15. What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means. And then his third question is in chapter 7, verse 7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Right? Okay. Yet if we had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Okay, so the question he's asking here in chapter 7, verse 7, the very beginning, is the law a bad thing? is the law a bad thing, since bondage to the law is not good? He gives the illustration that you are under the law, and if you're under the law, it's a bad husband. Okay, now he asks a question. Then is the law a bad thing by nature? Paul
No.
says, no, it's not a bad thing. Okay, now he gives three purposes of the law here, from verse 7, from verse 7 to 12. Okay, as far as three purposes of the law. First, and it's in the verse we just read, is three purposes of the law. The first reason is define sin. What's the purpose of the law? It defines sin, right? I would not have known sin, Paul says, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not says you shall not covet. So it defines sin. Okay, so the law exposes sin for what it is. It names it. It specifically names it. Now, in the Old Testament, there was a good period of time when humans lived, but there was no actual Torah. There was no actual law, but they were still aware of their sin from the law within. Remember, we talked about the conscience. Okay, but the thing is this, and I'm just thinking out loud here. Okay, is that, say for example, Joseph, Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with him. She grabs his shirt and he runs away like the roadrunner. Beep beep, runs away. And then she's left with his cloak. He tried to rape me, right? But I'm just processing this. I have no answer for this. How would Joseph knew something was wrong, but I'm thinking, was there a term? Was there a word, adultery? Was there a word, fornication? I have no clue. As far as the wording, right? The etymology, the specific words, the terms that they used. But the concepts, as far as something is deeply wrong about this, I'm sure happened. Because remember, Moses is writing about Joseph. Moses is writing about Cain and Abel. And this is where, around Moses' time, the words were already developed at this point. So as a result, he's writing this down. Okay, so again, I have no clue if they had terms that says this is fornication, this is adultery. But from the heart, they knew something was wrong in the sense of this is out of order. Because remember, there's a set order that God has created in the world. We go outside of it, we're living disordered lives. This is what St. Augustine communicates. Okay, but what the law does is it specifically identifies these things. It specifically mentions these things. Okay, so notice what's the sin that Paul uses in verse 7? Covetousness. I would not know what covetous meant unless the law says you shall not covet. Okay, we go before the law was there. So the first sin ever in humanity was the sin of male passivity. Okay, so there's three sins in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 3, we have the enemy first. Okay, do you think Satan was coveting God? I want that power. Isaiah 14. Eve. What does Eve do? I want to be God. Okay. Cain and Abel, right? So we have envy all around, but was it identified? Well, now it's identified. Okay. It happened in the human heart, even the angelic heart, if there is a heart, I have no clue. But the point is, it was there, it persisted. But now, after Exodus chapter 20, we were able to identify it. Okay, so first, it defines sin. Number two, it aggravates sin, or it aggravates the sin nature in our hearts. Look at verse 8. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of what? Covetousness. Back to covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. So essentially, there's an aggravation that happens in the human heart when it comes to the law. The notion of perversity is a desire to do something for no reason other than that it is forbidden. It's perverse. Okay? I want to do something because that sign over there says I cannot do it. That's the only reason why I want to do it. Okay, so perversity persists in the human heart, and this is what the law does. It aggravates the sin nature inside of us. Okay, so within all of us, the sin nature wants to do what it wants, but when there's a law, our hearts challenge it and says, I dare you. I want to defy you. And we do it just for the sake of doing it, even if there's no pleasure. Like I just say something like theft. People want to steal. Maybe it's not because of perversity, because they want the object. So there's a covetousness, there's a lust towards it. But there are certain things that people do. They don't want the object, or all they want to do is defile what the law says, defile what that sign says, because there's a scratch within the human heart that gets satisfied.
There's an arrogance about that. Like, you don't tell me what to do. I do
Exactly. There is, I mentioned St. Augustine. So he was a church, third, 4th century church father. And he wrote the book, the Confessions. Okay, and I brought it here. I want you to see it online, guys.
Wow.
Okay, so this is St. Augustine's Confessions, an autobiography, and he just writes the journey of his conversion, his struggle with sin, the desires, and I want to read to you a quote. Okay, and it's dealing with perversity here. A little bit of time.
Who
Okay.
is it?
Augustine.
Okay.
Augustine.
Thank you.
So St. Augustine is a very interesting church father in the sense that he lived around the time of the Roman Empire's fall, the western part, the western fall, and he wrote about it. And he says this, okay? Near our vineyard, there was a pear tree. Okay, there was a pear tree loaded with fruit, and through the fruit was not particular unattractive, neither in color or taste. So we saw a pear tree, and it wasn't that attractive. I didn't really care about the taste. Notice the pear. Okay, notice the pear at the cover. Okay, I and some other youths conceived the idea of shaking the pears off this tree, carrying them away. So he envisions me and my friends are gonna shake this pear tree and take some fruit and just go away, even though we don't desire it. We're not that we don't want to eat it. Okay, away. We set out late at night and stole all the fruit that we could carry. And this was not to feed ourselves. We may have tasted a few, but then we threw the rest to the pigs. So, I hear the noise too. But they have the pears, they taste some of it, and they throw it away. They don't even eat it. So why take all the pears? Okay? Our real pleasure was simply in doing something that was not allowed. That was it.
Mischievous.
I had plenty of better pears of my own. Okay? I only took these ones in order that I might be a thief. Once I had taken them, threw them away, and all I tasted in them was my own iniquity, which I enjoyed very much. St. Augustine. So the only reason why he took pears from the pear tree, even though he had better pears at home, they tasted better, and he wasn't even hungry, was what? Our real pleasure was simply in doing something that was not allowed. Okay? Now, our sin nature screams in relationship to the law of God, watch me. Our sin nature in relationship to the law of God, say the Torah, is watch me. Okay, and what I mean by that is this. The ultimate motive of our sin, every single sin, if you dissect every single one of them, is to be God. Every single one of them. If you dissect every single one, it's going to go to control, power, I want it my way, human autonomy, right? What did Satan tell Eve? You shall be like God. Okay? And that was the essence of the first sin, and is the essence of all other sins too. Is that you shall be like God. We have a deep desire in ourselves to be in complete control, for complete sovereignty of our lives. And if we can, the whole world. If we could. Okay? From a baby all the way to adulthood, what life does is ungods them. Our hearts want to be God. Right? And life, suffering, limitations tell us you can't be. And what do? Try me. Watch me. What is it? When we see the law of God, we say, watch me. Right? The law challenges our pursuit to be God-like. Okay? We don't say these words because it's so arrogant, but we act like this. Right? I'll read to you another quote by St. Augustine in his Confessions. In a perverse way, when we talk about perversity, all men imitate you, that's God, who put themselves far from you. Okay, those who live far from God are trying to be like you. That's the very essence of disobedience. Okay, what then was it that I loved in the theft of mine? In what way, awkwardly and perversely, did I imitate my Lord? I was trying to be like God when I did these things. I was trying to be in control and do whatever I wanted. Did I find it pleasant to break your law unpunished and so produce a darkened shadow of omnipotence? I want full power, control, right? What a sight, the servant running away from his master. And he says, but in following a shadow. He ends off with this. Could I enjoy what was forbidden for no other reason except that it was forbidden? I enjoyed what was forbidden just because it was forbidden. Okay? The law is infringement upon our sovereignty, causing us to retaliate. Okay? The more we are exposed to the law of God, the more our sin or our anti-God nature is aggravated into rebellion. Okay? The law of God has specific rules, laws, and our heart says, watch me, I'm going to defile these things. Okay? If for you guys online, if there was a sign that says you cannot touch this little paint right here, okay? It just says do not touch this screw right here, right there, okay? There is going to be a watch me. Does this give me pleasure if I touch this screw? Does it give me no? What is it? My curiosity, my control wants to defile that sign that says you shall not touch the screw.
Defiance.
So guess what I do? Boop. Right? Guys online, we're under a minute and we'll continue this, okay? We'll exit off and come right back on. How are we doing online, guys? Fine. Okay.
Pretty good. There was an earthquake in Costa Mesa today.
Yeah, no, we were talking about it earlier before.
Newport Beach.
Okay, is it Costa Mesa, Newport? It's all the same. All the same.
They all run together.
Yeah. Any questions as of now? No? So, number one, remember, sin, the law defines what sin is. Number two, it aggravates the sin nature in us. We want to challenge it. When I was going to the bathroom, I thought, this is just me being, if I were to be honest. Whenever there's a sign that says "Do not touch its wet paint," I'm always like,
Yeah, curiosity's bad sometimes.
and you want to feel it, right? And so we're just like it's not that bad, right? Like there's no pleasure in touching it or taste or but it's that scratch of curiosity inside, you know. I remember like going. There was another. I was in an exhibit one time in Canada. It was one of those museums where it was like an exhibit where they had the human body, and they had like humans that were dead, and they
took the skin off.
They took the skin off, and it was more to show. It was more to show muscles and what it looks like, and it's.
They had a huge horse like that too.
There was a horse there too.
Yeah.
But there was a sign that said, "Do not touch the body." I'm just like, move. I was like, I feel weird.
No, bell goes off. Stop.
One more. In Israel, there was I think it was a Gedi where David was running away from Saul, and they had toothbrushes. I think these were toothbrushes, and I looked around. I'm like, look, pluck. It's just a stick, you know. You justify it or whatever it is. I'll say that's a little different because you kind of want a souvenir. I think that's the draw. But you know the scratch. There's a part inside that if the sign never says "Do not touch the screw,"
You
no, you wouldn't even think about, hey, let's all touch the screw. But if the sign says "Do not touch the screw," it's going to challenge your pride that God, like, oh, I'm really watch.
The arrogance
Watch
comes
me.
through when you announce it. Hey, watch! I'm going to touch that.
Exactly.
Don't go to Russia then, because those little ladies with their babuskas sit by every picture, and if you try to do something, they come and tell you.
Right.
Or if you take a picture with a flash. In the Hermitage, they're like,
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming into that civilization, those standards, right? If you have no mask, you know, so your neighbors are going to report you. That's what happened in Canada or Hawaii, right? So it aggravates sin nature, but it also convicts us. The law convicts us of sin. Verse 9. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive, and I died. That first part of verse 9. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive. There's two ways to interpret this. I was once alive apart from the law. Well, how is Paul apart from the law? It's either the I, the personal pronoun, is even reference to Adam and Eve as far as their identification with them. And at one point, humanity in general was apart from the law, and that in Adam and Eve. But when the law came, I died. Or it's in reference to Paul before his bar mitzvah at age 13. As far as not really accountable to the law, and then at age 13 he is. The problem with that interpretation is Jews at a young age learned the Torah before age 13. So I'll take the first interpretation as far as it being reference to humanity. Regardless, I want us to think this: the law, if it's external, deceives us from us. Okay, the law, if it is external, deceives us from us. Meaning, look at when we look at the law of God, when I say external, I mean actions, doing stuff, right? And that's the way most Jews perceive the law of God, right? External. So if we look at the Ten Commandments, almost all of them are external, but the last one, okay. You shall not have no other gods before me. Okay, so it's kind of, you can see it in a person, right? The second one, you shall not make idols. Well, you're doing something, right? Aaron, the Israelites, you can see it, right? Number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay, so most people, when they hear that, the third commandment, you shall not take the Lord your God in vain. For us, that's like you use Jesus or God or anything in a swear word. Okay, that's the way we interpret it. It's taking the Lord's name in vain was really you're using God's name to justify evil. That's what taking God's name in vain it was. So I'm going to commit an evil act, but I'm going to use God's name in the midst of it. Right? So the Crusaders, right? When it came to the conquest, they wanted Jerusalem. That was the essence of what the Crusaders were. But the first crusade was under King Urban II, who wanted to reclaim Jerusalem, and there was a guy by the name of Godfrey of Bouillon, and he led an army and conquered Jerusalem, but in the midst of it, killed women and children. They were all Muslim, every single one of them. You expect kill the army, leave the men and the women alive, but they slaughtered everyone. Okay, but in the process of that, Pope Urban II said that if you kill anyone on Jerusalem ground, God, that's not considered sin. In fact, you'll have, and it's almost Islamic theology, is you'll have like house in heaven, you'll have money. This is so the Crusaders in justification. You know what they said? God wills it. Just vote in French, right? And they all it was a chant that they used to justify their actions. Okay, it's pretty. There's certain good things that happen from the Crusades, but there's a lot of bad. And what you'll hear from a lot of liberals is just the bad. You'll hear from the Muslims just the bad. Okay, the reason why I say there's a lot of bad, the Fourth Crusade were Christians killing Christians, so in the name of God. So I don't know, anyways, but using God's name in vain, and you hear a lot of people do this. Is that there's some? The Lord told me. I was convicted by, at the end of the day, this is the essence of what. But again, you can see it. God using the Lord's name in vain. The fourth. Remember the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. You could see that in someone, right? 5, honor your father and mother. You could see if honor toward the parent. 6, you shall not murder.
Yeah.
Obviously, you could see these are actions. What I'm trying to say, you could see it. 7, you shall not commit adultery. You can see that, okay. 8, you shall not steal. We could see that. We know if someone stole or not. 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Lying, right? And I think we could see that too. 10, okay, 10. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, or anything that is his. So wait. The last one, which was you shall not covet. That's a condition of the heart, right? If I'm on Instagram, I don't have Instagram anymore, but if I go on Instagram and I see friends and they're flaunting their life and they go, I think covetousness will come inside anyone if they don't have it and they want it. That's just human nature. But I can lie about it, right? But the point is covetousness is something that happens within the human heart, right? So the point is this, is when I say external law, meaning it can deceive you from you, is the Pharisees. Paul was a Pharisee. Look at verse 10 and 11. The very commandment that I promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. It deceived him. And it deceives you from you if it's external. Okay? Most Pharisees, most Jews, the way they perceive the law is I'm acting, I'm doing. But in reality, the law is, and we've taught, this is what Paul elaborates on, is that the law is internal. It's within. Okay, so the Old Testament, we always say, it was hard to follow. The Old Testament's all about law and the New Testament's about grace. No, the New Testament is about law too. It's a harder law to follow. The reason why, because it's internal, right? So who? Jesus, right? So the external law, you have heard that it was said from old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brothers will be liable of judgment. So anger is internal. You don't have to murder someone. The point of was, you can have, gross.
Froze again?
I saw the way I looked, so it's not that bad. So, essentially, what I'm saying is the law is when Jesus changes the law in the sense of it's not out there. You can lie to yourself and think, I've never killed a person, but you've been angry at someone. And just because you haven't killed them, the fact that you're angry, you have it in your heart. I've never committed adultery. Well, you've lusted after a woman, and that's just as equivalent in the heart. So think of the commandment that Paul brought about in Romans chapter 7. It was covetousness. It was the last commandment, right? And the point was it's internal, and that's what opened his eyes up to be like, I thought I was obedient, but in reality I was killing myself. I was lying. I was deceiving myself. He says in verse 11. Okay. Verse 12. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. So from chapter 7, verse 7, what shall we say? Is the law sin? By no means. Okay, what's wrong with the law? Verse 12, so the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. The law is good. Okay, the law is good. The problem is not out there with humanity or with things. The problem is in here. And that's what Paul is trying to get at. Okay, the problem's not out there. The problem is in here. He builds this up in Romans chapter 1, 2, and 3. Jews or the Gentiles, you're guilty of sin. It's within you. Jews, you have the Torah. You're still guilty of sin. Chapter 3, you're both guilty of sin. It's all within us. Okay, it is so natural for us to blame other people, to blame other things. And this is what happened in Genesis chapter 3. Sin happened, and they started blaming right away, and it's no different from today. It is hard for people to take personal responsibility. When someone takes personal responsibility, it is a sign of humility. It is a sign that they're dying to themselves. Because we naturally point the finger, right? Just look at contemporary American politics. No one takes responsibility. It's always the other person's fault. Ping pong. That's what the news is, right? Their fault, their fault, their fault. Can anyone say, this is my fault? I take responsibility on this, right? It's always the other person's fault. Okay? There's a British newspaper that sent out and inquired of famous authors 100 years ago, around 100 years ago, asking, what's wrong with the world? Okay? And the writer, who is G.K. Chesterton, famous writer, said, and they asked G.K. Chesterton to answer the question. If you know G.K. Chesterton, he's an apologist. He's a very well-rounded mind. Like, he's one of those minds that can talk about theology all day, talk about history all day, talk about math all day, talk about video games all day, just like right? And they asked him, what's wrong with the world? And this is what he wrote. Dear sir, I am yours, G.K. Chesterton. That was his response.
Wow.
What's wrong with the world? I am. And that is exactly what Paul is elaborating here. The law is not the problem. I'm the problem. The law exposes my problem. Okay? If there's a stop sign, you see the red, it says stop. Is there anything wrong with the stop sign? It's a stop sign. Matt, if this was Disney and the stop sign were alive, like, hey, what's wrong with me? right? It's a stop sign. But what does a stop sign imply?
To stop.
You can't
To
go.
stop. It also implies? You people cannot drive properly. Right? Disorderliness. But the stop sign implies, if you follow me, there's order. The stop sign implies, if you don't follow me, danger is about to happen. You're going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt other people. And that's what the law does. So the stop sign is innocent. It's the people that are the problem. It's the people in the cars that are the problem. There's always an issue, right? I'm on my phone, listen to a podcast or whatever it is, and then I crash and I blame the other person. We never take responsibility. But again, the stop sign is innocent. I'm the problem. Same thing with the law, right? Human nature is the problem. Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We need the law in order for us to protect us from us. Okay? We need the law from us to protect us from us. Because we're the problem, G.K. Chesterton. Right? And politics, the essence of the goal, the essence of politics is to what? Uphold the law. Okay? But when the government doesn't uphold the law, guess what happens? Societal chaos. Okay? It's been studied. When you have laws and you uphold them, society is good. When you have a law and you bring it down, society crumbles. The goal of the government is to uphold the law. When the government does this, bring the law down, society crumbles, and that's what we're seeing today.
Absolutely.
Okay? And what's the whole point behind this? Human nature and the law. The law exposes human nature. You see that? Now, if we're good, remember human nature, okay? If we're good by nature, guess what? We don't need a law, right? If we're good, we don't need the government, right? We don't need government. If we're good, we're not good. This is why we need government. Okay, so remember, the essence of, if you want to know what the heart behind it's been studied. Jonathan Haidt, who's a cultural anthropologist, he's not even a Christian, says the heart behind politics, as far as Democrat, Republican, conservative versus liberal, is what is your view of human nature. Okay, if you're liberal, chances are you believe that man is good, right? Yeah, let people go through the southern border. Oh, we don't need guns. Why do we need guns for? We don't need fences. You know, that's our assumption because of if man is good. But typically, conservatives, Republicans, they're typically Christian. Why? It's because of human nature. No, we need guns for defense. If a burglar comes in, they're not going to come in to give me flowers or a cake, right? Right? No. We need borders. We need a castle. This is the essence of a castle, was to protect people from bad people, right? Again, human nature. There was a couple that says, no, I'm going to prove to you that man is good. And they went to the Middle East to show that these Muslims were nice. Guess what happened? This couple dead. Right? Why? What they thought human nature was good. No. Human nature naturally is not good. This is why we need laws. This is why we need good government. And again, what is Paul saying? The law is neutral. There's nothing wrong with the law. It just exposes what's bad. And what's bad? I am. What's wrong with the world? I am. Okay? So, yeah, this is the end of chapter 7. Okay? So, chapter 7, verse 1 to 6, the illustration. We're either married to two people, the law or Christ. Well, is the law bad then? If we're divorced, if the law died, is there anything bad? No. The law is neutral. It just exposes what's really bad. And that's us. Okay? From verse 13 onward to the end of the chapter, Paul is going to elaborate on this point as far as us being what the issue is. The human heart. That's the ultimate enemy. You know what your greatest enemy in life is? You know the greatest enemy in your life is? You know who it is?
You.
We are.
Yourself.
I'm the greatest enemy to us is us. When you're young, and even if you're old, and you get into conflict, and you get into fights, and someone says this about you, and you don't talk to them, and you ghost them, and all these things that happen when you're young. Guess what happens? You grow up, and you die to self, and you take responsibility. And when you're at that point of taking responsibility, you look back at the situation when you were young, as far as the conflict, and you were like, when I was young, guess what I thought the problem was? I thought it was them. Them. They're the problem. They said that. But when you're older, you can still see that they did some harm, but you say, I think I overreacted. And you start taking responsibility. Guess what happens? You learn that, that was the problem there. It was my pride. And it's the same thing with life. Right?
It's pride, but it's also hateful. Just being hateful, a lot of hate going around, particularly now.
Yeah.
We could just learn not to let it get away with us.
Yeah. But it's the war that's inside of us, this thing called the flesh versus this thing called the spirit, and it's a reality in all of us, right? And this is why some people end up more fruitful when they're older. Some people end up really nasty. And we all have the same condition. If you're a believer, you have the spirit inside of you, and it has an opportunity to be fed. And this is what Paul's going to talk about later on. And we'll have to talk about that in 2 weeks. Any questions, guys, before we close? Guys online?
So we're not meeting next
No,
week?
sir.
What's that, Danny?
I said no, sir. No questions.
All right.
When are you going to start talking about the
Islam?
Muslims? You said you're going to take 3 weeks.
Yeah, so I'll be flying out to Toronto, Canada next Wednesday. So we're gonna take next week off, okay? Because I'll be landing in Canada on Thursday, and then we'll continue Romans 7, and then we'll do 8, and then after 8 we'll do Islam. And the reason why 8 is because we want to hit the halfway mark of Romans. There's 16 chapters in Romans, and so after 8 is 9, 10, 11, which is about divine election, which is a fun topic. So, yeah. So we'll talk about Islam after chapter 8.
All right.
Yeah, but I'll notify everyone and I'll let you know. And
So we're only missing one week.
yeah, we're just missing one next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we'll zoom.
And then
Are
we'll
we zooming here?
We can.
Yeah, I think
If
we'll
I can get my computer working.
we'll decide.
But yeah,
We'll talk
yeah,
about
we
that
can-
later.
We'll work it out.
Okay.
So, any questions before we close? No. Guys online?
Guys
Thanks, man.
online?
I have no questions.
All right. So, online, if we're gonna do communion, you're more than welcome to stay. If not, I will see you in 2 weeks.
Tell Ruben happy birthday.
Happy birthday, right?
Whose
Thank you.
birthday?